I'm Colette, 27 years old, and I'm standing outside my childhood home with a cashier's check for $50,000. My mother, Martha, stares in shock from the doorway, the same doorway she slammed in my face 11 years ago. You said I'd be back begging in a month, I say calmly. Well, I'm back, but not to beg. The irony tastes bittersweet as my mother's eyes fill with tears, reaching out with trembling hands. But I step back, remembering every night I spent hungry, cold, and alone at 16. Before I begin my story, let me ask, where are you watching from today? If you've ever faced family betrayal or had to prove someone wrong, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of triumph over adversity. Trust me, what happened between that devastating night 11 years ago and this moment of sweet vindication will absolutely blow your mind. Let's dive into how a homeless teenager became the one holding all the cards. The nightmare started when I was 16, living with my divorced mother, Martha, and my 12-year-old brother, Derek, in a cramped apartment in Cleveland. Life wasn't perfect, but we managed until Roger entered the picture. My mother met him at a bar where she worked nights, and within 3 months he'd moved into our home like he owned the place. From day one, Roger looked at me like I was trash he needed to take out. He'd make comments about my appearance. My friends, even the way I breathed, seemed to irritate him. I tried talking to Mom about it, but she was so desperate for male attention that she dismissed every concern. Roger's amazing, Colette, she'd say, while applying makeup to cover the stress lines that had deepened since the divorce. You just need to give him a chance. The tension escalated quickly. Roger would eat the lunch I'd packed for school and claim he thought it was leftovers. He'd enter my room without knocking, going through my things while I was at school. When I put a lock on my door, Mom made me remove it, saying I was being disrespectful to her boyfriend. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in October. I returned home from my part-time job at the grocery store to find my room ransacked. Roger stood in the living room with my mother holding my jewelry box, the one Dad had given me before he disappeared from our lives. He claimed I'd stolen $40 from his wallet and hidden it in my room. When he couldn't find the money, he said I must have already spent it on drugs. I had never touched his wallet, never stolen anything in my life, and certainly wasn't on drugs. I was a B student working 20 hours a week to save for college. But my mother's face had already hardened into that look I knew too well, the one that said she'd chosen her side before hearing mine. "How could you, Colette?" she screamed. "After everything I've done for you, Roger works hard for his money." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I tried to explain, showed her my work schedule, my recent pay stub, but she wasn't listening. Roger stood behind her, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Your daughter's trouble, Martha," he said, placing his hand on her shoulder. "Maybe it's time for tough love." What happened next remains burned into my memory like a brand. My mother stormed into my room and began throwing my belongings out the window. Clothes, school books, personal items, everything I owned rained down onto the street below. Neighbors gathered to watch the spectacle while I begged her to stop. "Please, Mom. I didn't take anything," I cried, but she was beyond reason. "You're 16 now, practically an adult," she shouted. "If you can't respect our home and the people in it, you can find somewhere else to live." I looked desperately at Derek, who watched from his bedroom doorway with tears streaming down his face. He started to speak up, but Roger shot him a warning look that sent him retreating into his room. The ultimatum came as she threw my backpack at my feet. "Get out. You'll be back, begging within a month when you realize how good you had it here. But I don't want to see your lying face until you're ready to apologize to Roger and follow the rules of this house." I stood there in shock, unable to process that my own mother was choosing a man she'd known for 3 months over her daughter. With shaking hands, I gathered what I could from the sidewalk, shoving clothes into my backpack, while neighbors whispered and pointed. I had $47 in my wallet from my last shift, the jewelry box Dad gave me, and nowhere to go. As I walked away from the only home I'd ever known, I heard the door slam behind me with a finality that echoed through my bones. The last thing I saw was Derek's face in his bedroom window, his palm pressed against the glass. That first night, I found myself in a 24-hour laundromat sitting on the floor between washing machines for warmth. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I counted my money again and again, trying to figure out how to make $47 last until I could figure something out. I was too proud to call the few relatives I had, knowing they'd call my mother, and I'd be forced back into that house with Roger. The weekend passed in a blur of hunger and fear. I showed up to school Monday morning, having barely slept, wearing the same clothes I'd left in. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Chen, noticed immediately. She called me into her office, took one look at the exhaustion on my face, and gently asked what was wrong. I wanted to tell her everything, to collapse into the chair and let an adult handle it, but I couldn't. The system had failed me before when Dad left, and I didn't trust it to help now. I told her I was staying with friends and everything was fine. She didn't believe me but couldn't force me to talk. She slipped me $20 and her personal phone number, making me promise to call if I needed anything. I took the money because I was desperate, but I knew I'd never make that call. Trust was a luxury I could no longer afford. The first month on the streets taught me lessons no 16-year-old should have to learn. After spending 3 nights in the laundromat, the owner caught on and banned me from the premises. I discovered that the city library was warm until 9 p.m., and the hospital emergency room waiting area was open all night if you looked sick enough. I learned which fast food restaurants threw out still edible food, and at what times. My pride died a little more each day, but survival became my only focus. By week 2, desperation led me to a rundown diner on the wrong side of town. The owner, Frank, was a gruff man in his 60s, who looked like he'd seen too much of life's ugly side. I begged for work, any work, and he must have seen something in my eyes, because he offered me an under-the-table position washing dishes for $5 an hour cash. The work was brutal, 14-hour shifts in a kitchen that violated every health code imaginable, but it came with an unspoken perk. Frank let me sleep in the storage room on a cot between boxes of supplies. It wasn't much, but it was better than the streets. I'd work from 6 a.m. until midnight, shower in the restaurant's bathroom, and catch a few hours of sleep before starting again. My hands cracked and bled from the constant exposure to hot water and harsh chemicals, but I never complained. School became an afterthought. I'd show up when I could, usually falling asleep in class, my grades plummeting from B's to D's and F's. Teachers who once praised my potential now looked at me with disappointment, or worse, pity. Meanwhile, my mother had begun her campaign of character assassination. She told relatives I'd been caught stealing, that I was on drugs, that I'd chosen the streets over following simple household rules. Her version of events spread through our extended family like wildfire. My Aunt Carol called the diner one day, and I foolishly hoped she was offering help. Instead, she lectured me about breaking my mother's heart and demanded I apologize to Roger. When I tried to explain what really happened, she cut me off. "Your mother told me everything, Colette. That nice man welcomed you into his home, and you repaid him by stealing. You should be ashamed." The call ended with her telling me not to contact any family members until I was ready to make things right. The betrayal from my extended family hurt almost as much as my mother's. These people had known me my whole life, had seen me grow up, yet they believed her lies without question. I learned that Roger had convinced my mother to change the locks on the apartment and block my number. Derek tried to help, secretly attempting to bring me food at school, but Roger caught him and convinced my mother that Derek needed to be protected from my bad influence. After that, even my little brother was forced to pretend I didn't exist. The isolation was complete. I had become a ghost in my own life, invisible to everyone who had once claimed to love me. Week 4 brought a new crisis. I'd been surviving on a combination of my diner wages and leftover food from work when immigration agents raided the restaurant. I wasn't undocumented, but several of Frank's other employees were. In the chaos, with agents demanding papers and Frank being arrested for hiring illegal workers, I grabbed my few possessions and ran. Just like that, I lost both my job and my shelter. Standing on the street with nowhere to go and less than $100 to my name, I finally understood how close I was to not making it. The temptation to call my mother was overwhelming. Maybe if I apologized, if I admitted to things I didn't do, I could have a bed again. But then I remembered her face as she threw my belongings out the window, and I knew I'd rather die on the streets than beg her for help. It was at the homeless shelter that I met Grace, a 19-year-old who'd been on the streets for 3 years. She took one look at me, a terrified 16-year-old trying to act tough, and decided to take me under her wing. Grace taught me the real rules of survival. She showed me which shelters were safe and which were hunting grounds for predators. She taught me how to make a weapon from everyday items, where to find free meals without shame, and most importantly, how to spot danger before it spotted you. We became inseparable, two young women trying to survive in a world that had thrown us away. Grace had run from an abusive stepfather, and like me, her family had chosen not to believe her. We shared more than just survival tips. We shared the pain of being discarded by the people who were supposed to protect us. One night at the bus station changed everything. Grace had gone to find us some food while I guarded our belongings. A well-dressed man approached me, friendly at first, offering to buy me dinner. When I declined, his demeanor shifted. He grabbed my wrist, insisting I was too pretty to be sleeping rough, that he had a warm place I could stay. I'd learned enough from Grace to know what he really wanted. Using the self-defense moves she'd taught me, I broke free and ran, but not before he'd torn my jacket and left bruises on my arm. That night, huddled in an abandoned building with Grace, I felt something inside me harden into steel. The scared 16-year-old who'd cried in the laundromat was gone. In her place was someone who understood that kindness from strangers came with a price, that trust was a weapon others would use against you, and that surviving meant becoming someone even I didn't recognize. The streets were teaching me lessons my mother never could. I learned to sleep with one eye open, to hide money in multiple places on my body, to look tough even when terrified. I discovered which churches offered free meals without sermons, which libraries had the cleanest bathrooms, which police officers would move you along, versus those who'd arrest you for loitering. Every day was a battle, and every night survived was a victory. But the cost was higher than I could have imagined. I was losing pieces of myself with each passing day, becoming harder, colder, more suspicious. The honor roll student who dreamed of college was disappearing, replaced by someone whose only dream was making it through another night. By the end of my 3rd month on the streets, winter was approaching. Cleveland winters are brutal, and I knew the cold would kill me before hunger would. I'd lost 20 pounds, my period had stopped from malnutrition, and a persistent cough rattled in my chest. But still, I refused to go back. Every time I wavered, I remembered my mother's words. "You'll be back begging within a month." Those words became my fuel, my reason to keep going when everything in me wanted to give up. I would prove her wrong if it killed me, and given how things were going, it just might. 3 months into my homeless nightmare, I thought salvation had arrived in the form of my Aunt Linda. She found me at a soup kitchen on the east side, her face a mask of concern as she rushed to embrace me. "Colette! Oh my God, look at you!" she cried, taking in my hollow cheeks and dirty clothes. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Your mother said you ran away, but I knew there had to be more to the story." Her words were a balm to my battered soul. Finally, someone who might believe me, might help me. Linda had always been the rebel in the family, the one who questioned things. When she offered me a place to stay, I wanted to refuse, my street instinct screaming that it was too good to be true. But winter was coming, and I was tired, so incredibly tired of fighting to survive every single day. Linda's house in Lakewood was modest but clean, a palace compared to where I'd been sleeping. That first night, I took the longest, hottest shower of my life, watching months of dirt and despair swirl down the drain. She'd prepared the guest room with fresh sheets and even bought some clothes in my size. Over dinner, I told her everything: the false accusations, Roger's manipulations, my mother choosing him over me. Linda listened without interrupting, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand. When I finished, she shook her head in disgust. I knew Roger was bad news the moment Martha introduced him. Classic predator behavior, isolating her from family, turning her against her own child. "You're safe here, honey. Stay as long as you need." For the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope. I enrolled in an online GED program determined to salvage my education. Linda helped me get a part-time job at a local pharmacy where her friend was the manager. The pay was minimum wage, but it was legal, steady work with a real paycheck. I opened my first bank account, depositing every penny I didn't absolutely need for essentials. The goal was simple: save enough to get my own place, finish my GED, and build a life that no one could take away from me. For 6 weeks, I lived in this bubble of normalcy, allowing myself to believe I'd escaped the nightmare. I should have known better. The streets had taught me that when things seem too good to be true, they usually are. The ambush came on a Thursday evening. I returned from work to find my mother's car in Linda's driveway, my stomach dropping to my feet. Through the window, I could see Martha, Roger, and Linda sitting in the living room like they were having a casual family gathering. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but Linda had already seen me. She opened the door with a strange smile. "Colette, come in. Your mother has something she wants to discuss with you." Against my better judgment, I entered, keeping my back to the wall and my eyes on the exits. My mother looked different, thinner, older, but her eyes held the same hardness from the night she'd thrown me out. Roger sat beside her, his arm possessively around her shoulders, that same satisfied smirk on his face. Martha started with tears, a performance worthy of an Oscar. "I've been so worried about you, baby. Living on the streets, dropping out of school. This isn't the life I wanted for you." I remained silent, watching Roger's face more than hers. He was the puppet master here, and his expression would tell me what this was really about. She continued through her crocodile tears. "I want you to come home. We can work things out, be a family again." That's when Roger played his hand. Of course, he interjected smoothly, there would need to be some conditions. "You'd need to apologize for the theft and the lies you've spread about me. And you'd need to follow the house rules, including contributing to household expenses." The real agenda clicked into place like puzzle pieces. Tax season was coming, and they needed me back in the house to continue claiming me as a dependent. Roger went on, revealing more of their scheme. "Your mother's been maintaining your room, keeping your enrollment at your old school active. As far as the authorities know, you never left. But if you don't come back soon, we might have to report you as a runaway. That could complicate things for everyone, especially you. The threat was clear: come back and play happy family for their financial benefit, or they'd make my life even harder." The audacity of it took my breath away. They'd thrown me out, spread lies about me, and now wanted to use me for tax fraud. I found my voice surprising myself with how steady it sounded. "You kicked me out. You threw my belongings out a window and told me not to come back until I was ready to apologize for something I didn't do." Martha's tears dried instantly, her face hardening. I did what any mother would do to protect her home from a thief and a liar. The mask had slipped, showing me the woman who'd chosen a 3-month relationship over her 16-year-old daughter. Roger leaned forward, his tone becoming more threatening. "You should think carefully about this, Colette. Your mother's been very generous, keeping you on her benefits, maintaining your health insurance. All of that could disappear with one phone call." That's when Linda revealed her true colors. "Colette, be reasonable," she said, and I heard the rehearsed quality in her voice. "Your mother's offering you a second chance. Not many kids get that after what you did." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Linda had been in on it from the beginning. The concern, the shelter, the job, all of it had been orchestrated to get me comfortable enough to manipulate. I looked at my aunt, the woman who'd pretended to believe me, who'd held me while I cried about my mother's betrayal. How much did she promise you? I asked quietly. Linda's face flushed, confirming my suspicion. This had been a business transaction with me as the commodity. The room erupted in accusations and denials, but I was already moving. I excused myself to use the bathroom, knowing I had seconds before they realized I was running. I locked the door, opened the window, and squeezed through, dropping into Linda's backyard. Behind me, I could hear pounding on the door, Roger's voice demanding I come out. I ran to the garage where I knew Linda kept her emergency cash in an old toolbox, a detail she'd foolishly shared during one of our bonding conversations. $200 in 20s probably meant for household emergencies. Well, this was my emergency. I took it without guilt. She'd been paid to betray me. Consider this my fee for the performance. I heard the front door slam as they realized I'd escaped. Roger's voice carried across the yard, shouting that I was a thief and they should call the police. But they wouldn't, not when it would expose their tax fraud scheme. I ran through backyards and alleys, my heart pounding with equal parts adrenaline and devastation. The job, the bank account, the GED progress, all of it was gone. I couldn't go back to the pharmacy where Linda's friend would surely fire me. My carefully saved money was in a bank account I couldn't risk accessing, knowing they might be monitoring it. In one evening, I'd lost everything again, but this time it was worse. This time, I'd lost the last shred of faith that any family member would help me. As I found myself back on the streets, winter closing in, I thought about Grace and how she'd warned me about trusting family. They're the ones who hurt you worst, she'd said, because they know exactly where to stick the knife. I'd lost touch with her during my weeks at Linda's, and now I couldn't find her at any of our usual spots. The other street kids told me she'd overdosed 3 weeks ago alone in an alley while I was playing house in Lakewood. The guilt and grief nearly broke me. Grace had saved my life, taught me to survive, and I hadn't been there when she needed someone. Her death was a harsh reminder that the streets don't pause their cruelty just because you think you've found a way out. That night, huddled in a doorway as snow began to fall, I made myself a promise. No more trust, no more hope in family, no more believing in rescue. If I was going to survive, it would be on my own terms, by my own rules. My mother, Roger, Linda, they'd all shown me who they really were. The only family I'd had on the streets was gone, and the one waiting in warm houses had proven they'd sell me out for the right price. As the temperature dropped, and I pulled newspapers around me for warmth, I let go of the last piece of the girl who'd believed in family loyalty. From now on, I was alone, and that would be my strength, not my weakness. Winter in Cleveland arrived with a vengeance, and with it came the hardest months of my life. The shelters were overcrowded, turning away people every night, and priority went to women with children or the elderly. A 17-year-old girl didn't rank high enough to guarantee a bed. I learned to arrive at 4 p.m. for evening shelters, sometimes standing in line for 3 hours in the freezing cold only to be turned away. The nights I couldn't get inside, I rode the public buses until they stopped running, then found doorways with heat vents or broke into abandoned buildings with other homeless youth. We'd huddle together for warmth, taking turns keeping watch, knowing that freezing to death was a real possibility if we all fell asleep. By December, the persistent cough I'd developed turned into something worse. I woke up one morning in an abandoned factory, unable to breathe properly, my chest feeling like someone was sitting on it. The fever had me hallucinating, seeing my mother's face in the shadows, hearing Roger's laughter in the wind. Another homeless woman found me and called an ambulance, probably saving my life. The hospital diagnosed me with severe pneumonia, pumping me full of antibiotics and keeping me for 3 days. Those 3 days in a warm bed with regular meals felt like heaven, but they came with a price. Without insurance, the bill was astronomical, a debt that would haunt me for years. A social worker named Emma visited my bedside on the second day. She was young, maybe late 20s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded me of what I'd lost. She tried to get me to open up about my situation, offering resources for homeless youth, talking about foster care alternatives. But I'd learned my lesson about trusting adults who promised help. I gave her a fake name, a fake story about being 18 and just down on my luck. She didn't believe me, I could see it in her eyes, but she couldn't force me to accept help. She left her card anyway, making me promise to call if things got desperate. I threw it away as soon as she left. Things were already desperate, and no social worker could fix what was broken in my life. Released from the hospital with nowhere to go and still weak from illness, I hit rock bottom on my 17th birthday, January 15th, and I found myself behind a restaurant digging through their dumpster for food. The irony wasn't lost on me. A year ago, I'd celebrated at home with a cake my mother had made, surrounded by family. Now I was pulling half-eaten sandwiches from the trash, grateful to find anything that wasn't completely spoiled. As I sat in that alley eating discarded food like an animal, my mother's words echoed in my mind. "You'll be back begging within a month." It had been 4 months and I hadn't begged. But sitting there, trash juice on my hands, body still weak from pneumonia, I wondered if this was worse than begging. That night, something shifted inside me. The self-pity and despair transformed into pure, white-hot anger. Anger at my mother for choosing a man over her child. Anger at Roger for destroying my family. Anger at Linda for betraying me. Anger at a system that allowed kids to fall through cracks so wide they might as well be canyons. But most of all, anger at myself for almost giving up. I'd survived 4 months of hell, and I'd be damned if I'd let them win now. That anger became my fuel, burning away the last vestiges of the scared girl who'd been thrown away. In her place rose someone harder, more determined, someone who would prove them all wrong if it took the rest of my life. The next morning, I dragged myself to a day labor agency I'd heard about from other homeless people. They didn't ask for ID if you looked old enough, and they paid cash at the end of each day. The work was brutal: loading trucks, cleaning construction sites, doing whatever nobody else wanted to do. But it was work, and it paid. I showed up every morning at 5 a.m., no matter how sick I felt, no matter how little sleep I'd gotten. The supervisor, Carl, noticed my work ethic. Unlike others who showed up drunk or high, I was always sober, always willing to take the worst jobs without complaint. After 2 weeks, he pulled me aside. "You're too smart to be doing this kind of work, kid. What's your story?" I fed him a carefully crafted lie about being 18, having aged out of foster care, just needing steady work to get on my feet. Carl wasn't stupid. He knew I was lying about something, but he also recognized desperation when he saw it. He offered me a permanent position at the warehouse where he was a shift manager, $15 an hour full-time with benefits after 90 days. The catch was, I'd need documentation. That night, I spent my day's wages on a fake ID from a guy the other street kids knew. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to pass a cursory check. I became Jennifer Walsh, age 18, and landed my first real job through fraud. I wasn't proud of it, but pride was a luxury I couldn't afford. With steady income, I could finally get off the streets. The room I rented was in a neighborhood where gunshots were a nightly lullaby, and the landlord didn't ask questions as long as you paid in cash. It was a single room with a hot plate, a mattress on the floor, and a bathroom I shared with 3 other tenants. But it had a door that locked walls that kept out the wind, and it was mine. I cried that first night, not from sadness, but from relief. After 5 months of homelessness, I had an address again. It wasn't much, but it was a foundation to build on. Working nights at the warehouse, I used my days to study for the GED. The local library became my classroom, their free Wi-Fi, my connection to online education. Without electricity in my room, most days I studied by candlelight when I had to determine to at least finish high school equivalency. The test fee was $75, representing 2 weeks of saving every penny not spent on absolute necessities. When I passed on my first try, scoring in the 95th percentile, I had no one to celebrate with. I bought myself a cupcake from the grocery store day-old section and ate it alone in my room, but it was still a victory. Carl became the closest thing I had to a mentor, though he never knew my real story. He taught me about logistics, inventory management, supply chain efficiency. I soaked up knowledge like a sponge, volunteering for extra shifts, learning every job in the warehouse. When he recommended me for a supervisor training program, I jumped at the chance. The other workers, mostly older men, resented taking orders from a teenage girl, but I'd faced worse than their attitudes. I worked harder than anyone, never asking someone to do something I wouldn't do myself, slowly earning, if not respect, at least compliance. 6 months into the job, my carefully constructed new life faced its first major threat. Derek, now 18 and freshly graduated, found me through a co-worker's social media post that happened to catch me in the background. He showed up at the warehouse during my shift, and my heart nearly stopped. He'd grown taller, his face more mature, but his eyes still held that same sadness from the night our mother threw me out. We met at a diner after my shift, and the story he told made my blood run cold. Roger had been arrested for tax fraud, but not before he'd convinced our mother that I was somehow involved, that I'd been the one to report him. She'd filed a missing person report not out of concern, but to maintain her story that I was still a dependent living at home. The benefits she'd been collecting illegally were cut off when Roger's scheme unraveled, and now she was facing eviction. According to Derek, she spent her days ranting about how I'd ruined her life, how my jealousy of Roger had destroyed our family. The delusion was so complete that she'd convinced herself I was living some glamorous life somewhere, deliberately staying away to hurt her. Derek didn't believe her stories anymore. Hadn't for a long time, but he'd been trapped, threatened with the same fate if he defended me. Now that he was 18 and heading to college, he'd sought me out to warn me and to apologize for not doing more. I forgave him instantly. He'd been a child manipulated and threatened, just like I had been. What Derek revealed next changed everything. Our maternal grandfather had died while I was on the streets, leaving a small inheritance to each grandchild. Nothing huge, about $10,000 each, but money our mother had claimed as guardian since I was missing and Derek was still a minor. She'd spent mine on Roger's legal fees and keeping the apartment after losing her benefits. The rage I felt was incandescent. While I'd been eating from dumpsters and nearly dying of pneumonia, she'd been spending my inheritance on the man who destroyed our family. Derek offered to help me fight for it legally, but I knew it was gone. Just another thing she'd stolen from me. Instead of dwelling on what I'd lost, I focused on what I could still save. Derek had a partial scholarship to state school, but it wouldn't cover everything. Without hesitation, I gave him every penny I'd managed to save, about $3,000, to help with his first-year expenses. He tried to refuse, knowing what that money had cost me, but I insisted. One of us had to make it out clean, without the stain of homelessness and desperation. He could have the college experience, I'd never get the normal life that had been stolen from both of us. As he left that diner promising to stay in touch, I felt a shift in my purpose. It wasn't just about proving my mother wrong anymore. It was about building something so undeniable that her lies would crumble in the face of my success. By 19, my life had found a rhythm that almost resembled stability. The warehouse job that had saved me from the streets became my university, teaching me more about business operations than any classroom could. I'd been promoted to shift manager, overseeing a team of 15 people and managing inventory worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Carl had become more than a supervisor, he was the father figure I'd never had, though he still didn't know my real name or story. Under his mentorship, I learned to read financial reports, understand profit margins, negotiate with suppliers, and most importantly, lead people who had every reason to resent taking orders from someone so young. Living frugally had become second nature. While my coworkers spent their wages on cars and entertainment, I continued living in that same rough neighborhood, saving 70% of every paycheck. My room now had electricity most months, and I'd upgraded from a hot plate to an actual kitchenette. But luxury wasn't my goal. Every dollar saved was a dollar towards the future I was building brick by brick. I'd opened multiple bank accounts under my assumed name, spreading my money around in case one was compromised. Paranoid maybe, but the streets had taught me that everything you have can disappear in an instant if you're not careful. The real breakthrough came through community college night classes. I'd enrolled in business management courses paying cash, still using my fake identity. Professor Mitchell taught operations management, and something about my questions and insights caught his attention. I stayed after class asking about real-world applications relating everything to my warehouse experience. He saw through my carefully maintained facade of being just another young student recognizing someone who'd learned business through necessity rather than textbooks. When he offered me an internship at his brother's logistics company, I almost said no. Getting closer to people meant more chances for my past to surface. But the opportunity was too good to pass up. Mitchell Logistics was a mid-sized company specializing in supply chain solutions for retail businesses. The internship was supposed to be filing papers and fetching coffee, but within a week I was reorganizing their inventory tracking system. Years of making do with nothing had taught me to see inefficiencies others missed. I created a new routing system that cut delivery times by 15%, implemented a digital tracking solution using free software I discovered, and recovered $50,000 in lost inventory that had been miscategorized. James Mitchell, the owner, took notice. By the end of my 3-month internship, he offered me a full-time position as an operations analyst with a starting salary that made my warehouse pay look like pocket change. This was the moment everything could have fallen apart. A real corporate job meant real background checks, real references, real problems for someone living under a false identity. I spent sleepless nights debating whether to run or risk exposure. Finally, I decided to take a calculated risk. I approached James privately, telling him a version of the truth that I was estranged from family, had been on my own since 16, and had some documentation issues. I expected him to withdraw the offer immediately. Instead, he listened quietly, then asked a single question. "Can you do the job?" When I said yes, he nodded. "Then we'll figure out the rest." He helped me navigate the legal channels to establish my identity properly, a process that took months and every penny of my savings, but finally made me a real person again. Working at Mitchell Logistics was like entering a different world. I had an office, a computer, a real email address with my actual name. The imposter syndrome was overwhelming those first months. Surrounded by college graduates with normal backgrounds, I felt my lack of formal education acutely. But what I lacked in degrees, I made up for in hunger and real-world experience. I worked 60-hour weeks learning everything I could about corporate operations, supply chain management, financial analysis. My colleagues went home to families and social lives. I went home to my tiny apartment and online courses, determined to fill the gaps in my knowledge. 6 months into the job, my past caught up with me in the most public way possible. I was leading a presentation to a major client when the conference room door burst open. There stood my mother, looking haggard and desperate, with 2 security guards trying to restrain her. She started screaming about how I owed her money, how I'd destroyed her life, how I needed to take responsibility for my actions. The client, a conservative Midwest company, sat in shocked silence as my mother was dragged out, still yelling that I was an ungrateful daughter who'd stolen from her and left her to suffer. The meeting ended in disaster, the client pulling out of what would have been a $2 million contract. I sat in James's office afterward, certain I was about to be fired. The liability I represented was too great, the drama too much for a professional environment. But James surprised me again. He'd done his own investigation after hiring me, knew more about my story than I'd told him. He knew about the false accusations, the homelessness, the struggle to survive. What he said next changed my perspective forever. "Colette, I hired you because you survived something that would have broken most people. That takes a kind of strength and intelligence you can't learn in school. Your mother's lies don't define you. Your work does. And your work is exceptional. We'll weather this storm together. The story of my mother's outburst spread through the business community, but instead of destroying me, it had an unexpected effect. Other business owners reached out, some sharing their own stories of overcoming family trauma, others impressed by my resilience. The client we lost was replaced by 3 others who valued merit over background. But the most significant impact was personal. For the first time since that night I was thrown out, I had people in my corner who knew my truth and stood by me anyway. The isolation that had been my armor for so long began to crack. My mother's public meltdown had consequences for her as well. Roger had long since abandoned her for a younger woman with better credit, leaving her with debt and legal troubles from their joint schemes. The family members who'd believed her lies began to see cracks in her story. How could I have ruined her life when I'd been a homeless teenager? How could I owe her money when she'd thrown me out? The false missing person report came to light during the investigation into Roger's tax fraud, revealing that she'd known exactly where I wasn't the whole time. One by one, the relatives who'd shunned me began reaching out apologies mixed with requests to hear my side of the story. Derek graduated college that spring, and I attended the ceremony despite knowing our mother would be there. She tried to approach me, but I walked past her like she was invisible. The woman who'd given birth to me had become a stranger the night she chose Roger over her own child. Derek introduced me to his friends as the sister who'd saved his life, who'd given him her last dollar to ensure he could finish school. He was working now, trying to pay me back, but I refused the money. His success was payment enough. Watching him walk across that stage, knowing he'd made it out clean, healed something in me I didn't know was still broken. That summer, I received a message that made my blood boil and my heart race simultaneously. Aunt Linda wanted to meet, claiming she had information about our grandfather's estate that could help me recover my stolen inheritance. Every instinct screamed trap, but curiosity won. We met in a public place, a busy restaurant where she couldn't pull another ambush. She looked older, worn down by guilt or life, or both. The story she told was worse than I'd imagined. My mother had stolen not just the $10,000 inheritance, but also a college fund our grandfather had set up, nearly $30,000 meant for my education. Linda had helped facilitate the theft, signing documents as a witness, believing my mother's lies about protecting the money from my supposed drug habit. The guilt had been eating at Linda, especially after learning the truth about my homelessness from Derek. She offered to testify if I wanted to pursue legal action to help me recover what was stolen. The old me, the angry teenager surviving on the streets, would have jumped at the chance for revenge. But sitting there wearing a suit that cost more than I'd made in a month at the warehouse, I realized something. The money was gone, spent on a man who'd used and discarded my mother like trash. Taking her to court wouldn't get it back, it would only keep me tied to her dysfunction. I thanked Linda for the information but declined her offer. The best revenge wasn't legal action. It was living well, despite what they'd stolen from me. The years between 22 and 26 transformed me from a survivor into a success story that even I couldn't have imagined. My work at Mitchell Logistics had caught the attention of larger firms, and I found myself recruited by a Fortune 500 company to manage their regional distribution network. The salary they offered was more than my mother had ever made in a year, but money had stopped being my primary motivator. What drove me was the need to build something so solid, so undeniable, that no one could ever pull the ground out from under me again. Every promotion, every achievement was another brick in the fortress I was constructing around my life. By 25, I'd leveraged my experience into a consulting business, helping companies optimize their supply chains and reduce waste. The girl who'd once counted pennies to buy ramen was now billing $300 an hour to tell executives how to run their operations more efficiently. The irony wasn't lost on me that my expertise came from years of making something from nothing, stretching resources beyond their limits, finding solutions where none seemed to exist. Homelessness had been my Harvard Business School teaching me lessons about efficiency and survival that no classroom could replicate. I bought a house in the suburbs in a neighborhood where I'd once been chased away for looking too disheveled, too obviously homeless. Walking through those rooms for the first time, I thought about all the places I'd slept: the laundromat floor, abandoned buildings, hospital waiting rooms that infested storage closet at the diner. Now I had 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a kitchen bigger than some of the places I'd lived. But the room that meant the most was the smallest, a study lined with books, every title a gap in my education I'd filled on my own. I kept a photo on the desk, not of family, but of the public library where I'd studied for my GED by candlelight. It reminded me that everything could be taken away except what was in my mind. Meanwhile, my mother's life had become a cautionary tale of choices and consequences. Roger had left her within months of his release, taking what little she had left and disappearing with a woman half his age. The apartment she'd prioritized over her daughter was lost to eviction. She bounced between relatives, wearing out her welcome with the same lies and manipulation that had once worked so well. Each family member eventually saw through her victim act, especially when they learned the truth about my homelessness. The woman who'd thrown her 16-year-old daughter onto the streets for a man she'd known 3 months found herself experiencing the very fate she'd condemned me to. The relatives who'd once believed her lies now reached out to me with apologies and revelations. Cousin Marie told me how my mother had borrowed money claiming I was in rehab and needed treatment. Uncle Robert revealed she'd sold family heirlooms, saying I'd stolen and pawned them first. Each story added another layer to the fiction she'd created, an elaborate lie that had eventually collapsed under its own weight. They wanted me to forgive them for believing her, to understand they'd been manipulated. I forgave them because holding on to anger was like drinking poison, but forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. They'd shown me who they were when I needed them most. That was a lesson worth more than any apology. Derek graduated with honors and landed a job at a tech firm in Seattle. We maintained our relationship carefully, understanding that our mother was a topic too painful to discuss at length. He told me she'd tried living with him briefly, but her inability to take responsibility for anything made it impossible. She blamed me for Roger leaving, for her financial problems, for the family turning against her, for everything except her own choices. Derek had established boundaries I wished I'd known how to set at 16. He helped her financially when he could, but refused to enable her delusions or accept her abuse. It gave me hope that at least one of us had learned healthy patterns. The turning point came when I received a call from a hospital in Columbus. My mother had been admitted for malnutrition and exposure, found sleeping in a park during a cold snap. As her emergency contact from old records, they needed someone to make decisions about her care. The irony was suffocating. The woman who'd thrown me to the streets at 16 was now experiencing homelessness at 55. Every vindictive bone in my body wanted to hang up to let her experience the full weight of what she'd put me through. But I wasn't her. I'd built my life on being everything she wasn't: responsible, compassionate within boundaries, and capable of doing the right thing, even when it hurt. I drove to Columbus that night, seeing her for the first time in years. The hospital bed made her look small, fragile, in a way that conflicted with my memories of her rage. She was awake when I entered, and the look of shock on her face would have been comical if it weren't so sad. "You came," she whispered, and I heard genuine surprise. Despite everything, she hadn't expected me to show up. I sat in the visitor's chair, maintaining distance, and laid out the situation clearly. I would pay for her immediate care and a month in a residential facility to get her stable. After that, she would need to figure out her own path. There would be no ongoing financial support, no invitation back into my life, just this one act of mercy she'd never shown me. What happened next broke something in both of us. She started crying, not the manipulative tears I remembered, but something raw and real. She told me about the nights after I left, how Roger had convinced her I was probably better off, how she'd chosen to believe him, because the alternative meant admitting she'd thrown away her daughter for nothing. She revealed that he'd been abusive in ways she'd hidden, controlling her through fear and manipulation, but she'd been too proud to admit she'd chosen an abuser over her own child. The story poured out of her years of justifications crumbling as she finally faced the truth of what she'd done. I listened without comment, letting her confession wash over me without letting it wash away the pain. When she finished, I spoke carefully. "Mom, I understand you were in a bad situation with Roger, but I was 16. You were supposed to protect me, not throw me away. You chose him, and then you chose to lie about me to everyone who might have helped. You stole my inheritance while I was eating from dumpsters. You filed false reports and committed fraud while I nearly died on the streets. I can forgive you for being weak. I can't forget that you were cruel." The words hung between us, years of pain condensed into simple truths. She asked the question I'd been dreading. Is there any chance we could try again? Any possibility of being mother and daughter? I thought about all the nights I'd dreamed of her finding me, apologizing, being the mother I'd needed, but that dream belonged to the 16-year-old who no longer existed. "I'm not your daughter anymore," I said quietly. "That girl died in a laundromat 3 days after you threw her out. I'm someone else now, someone you don't know and didn't raise. I'll help you this once because it's the right thing to do, but we're strangers now. Whatever we might have been ended when you chose Roger over me." The facility I checked her into specialized in helping older adults transition from homelessness. I paid for job training programs, mental health support, and temporary housing assistance. It was more than she'd ever done for me, but less than a daughter might do for a mother who'd earned that title. The staff told me she attended every session, applied for every job, followed every rule. Maybe hitting bottom had finally taught her what it had taught me, that survival requires change, adaptation, and taking responsibility for your choices. I didn't follow up to see if she succeeded. That was her journey, not mine. Which brings us back to where this story began, standing outside my childhood home with a check for $50,000. The house belonged to my mother's sister, now inherited after my grandmother passed. My mother lived there on sufferance, doing housework in exchange for a room. I'd been invited to a family reunion, the first I'd attended since being thrown out. Most relatives had apologized over the years, but this was different, a formal acknowledgement of the lies they'd believed and the harm they'd allowed. I came not for closure, but to make a statement that needed witnessing. My mother answered the door, and the years between us collapsed into that single moment. She looked older, worn down by hard living and harder choices. But her eyes, when they saw me, held something I'd never seen before, genuine pride mixed with profound regret. "You came," she said, just as she had in the hospital. But this time I heard the weight of all the times I hadn't come, all the holidays and birthdays and ordinary days when a daughter should have been there. I stepped inside the house that had once been my whole world, now feeling like a museum of someone else's life. The living room was full of relatives, the same ones who'd turned their backs when I needed them. They fell silent as I entered, the successful woman who'd risen from the ashes of their abandonment. I didn't make speeches or dramatic announcements. Instead, I simply handed the check to Derek, who'd just been accepted to graduate school at MIT. "This is for your education," I said loud enough for everyone to hear, "so you never have to depend on anyone else's promises or charity." The amount was exactly what had been stolen from me, plus what it could have grown to if invested properly. Poetic justice delivered with compound interest. My mother's reaction was immediate and predictable. "You have all that money and you never helped me. I'm your mother. I raised you." The old arguments, the same entitlement that had justified every betrayal. But I was prepared for this moment, had rehearsed it in therapy sessions that helped me process the trauma into strength. "You're right," I said calmly. "You did raise me. You raised me to be self-sufficient when you threw me out at 16. You raised me to be resourceful when I had to survive on the streets. You raised me to be independent when you chose a man over your child. You raised me to be successful by showing me exactly who I never wanted to become. The room was silent, the truth hanging heavy in the air. Other relatives tried to mediate, suggesting forgiveness and moving forward, but I raised my hand to stop them. "I've already forgiven her," I said. Forgiveness was for me to stop carrying poison in my heart. But reconciliation requires accountability, and she's never once admitted what she really did. Even now, she sees herself as the victim. Even now, she believes she's owed something for giving birth to me. I owe her nothing except the truth, and that's what I'm giving all of you today. I turned to address the room, these people who'd been my family once. When she threw me out, you all believed I was a thief and a drug addict without ever asking for my side. When I was sleeping in abandoned buildings and eating from dumpsters, you told me I should apologize to the man who destroyed my life. When I nearly died from pneumonia at 17 alone, and afraid you were sending her money because she said I'd stolen from her. Each of you made a choice to believe lies instead of seeking truth. I survived despite you, not because of you. And I'm here today not to blame you, but to make sure everyone knows the real story. My mother tried one last manipulation, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to understand. I was scared, she sobbed. Roger said he'd leave if I didn't choose, and I couldn't be alone again. I thought you were strong enough to handle it, that you'd be okay. I made a mistake, but I've paid for it. Haven't I paid enough? The plea might have moved me once, but I'd spent too many years in therapy understanding the narcissism behind her words. Even now, her suffering was the center of her universe. Even now, she couldn't simply say, "I'm sorry I hurt you," without making it about her pain. I looked at her one last time, this stranger who'd given birth to me. You made a choice, and choices have consequences. You chose a 3-month relationship over your 16-year-old daughter. You chose lies over truth, cruelty over kindness, a man over your child. Yes, you've suffered, but suffering doesn't erase harm. I've built a life where I don't need you, don't miss you, don't think of you except as a cautionary tale. That's not cruelty. That's consequence. The check I gave Derek is the last connection between us. After today, we're done. Before leaving, I visited my old room one final time. Another child lived there now. My cousin's daughter, the walls covered with different posters, different dreams. I thought about the girl who'd once lived here, who'd done homework at that desk and cried into that pillow and believed her mother would always protect her. That girl deserved better than she got, but she became someone better than she ever could have imagined. In the end, the cruelty that was meant to break her forged her into steel. The abandonment meant to destroy her taught her to build an unshakable foundation. As I drove away from that house for the last time, I thought about the journey from 16 to 27. Every night spent cold and hungry, every day worked to exhaustion, every barrier overcome and boundary built had led to this moment. Not the dramatic confrontation I'd once imagined, but something better, a life so full and successful that the absence of a mother was barely noticeable. My chosen family of mentors, friends, and colleagues had shown me more love than she ever had. My accomplishments belonged to me alone, unshared with someone who'd tried to destroy me before I could bloom. That evening, I drove past all the landmarks of my survival. The laundromat where I'd spent my first night homeless had been torn down, replaced by luxury condos. The diner where Frank had given me work was now a chain restaurant. The abandoned building where I'd nearly frozen to death was gone, the lot empty and waiting for development. But the library where I'd studied for my GED still stood, and I stopped to make a donation to their youth programs. The librarian who'd once let me stay past closing, pretending not to notice I had nowhere to go, was still there. She recognized me despite the years and the transformation. "I knew you'd make it," she said simply. "You had that look like nothing could stop you." The final stop was the shelter where Grace and I had met, where she'd taught me to survive before the streets claimed her. I'd established an annual scholarship in her name, providing transitional housing and education funds for homeless youth aging out of the system. The director showed me the wall of success stories, young people who'd used the Grace Thompson Memorial Fund to escape the streets. Her last name wasn't really Thompson, I admitted. I never knew her real last name. She was just Grace, and she saved my life by teaching me to save myself. Now her memory saves others the way she would have wanted. As I sat in my office that night, CEO of my own logistics consulting firm with clients across the country, I allowed myself one moment of what if. What if my mother had chosen differently that October night? What if she'd believed me, protected me, chosen her daughter over a manipulative man I might have graduated high school? Normally gone to college on my grandfather's money, lived an ordinary life, without trauma or triumph. But then I wouldn't have learned that strength comes from surviving what should break you. I wouldn't have discovered that family isn't blood but choice. I wouldn't have built something from nothing and proven that where you come from doesn't determine where you're going. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek, a photo of him and his study group at MIT, my check, paying for the education our mother had tried to steal from both of us. Below it, another message from James Mitchell, my first real boss, congratulating me on landing a major contract with Amazon. Then Emma, the social worker who tried to help me in the hospital, reaching out to say another homeless teen had been placed in housing thanks to my foundation. These were my people, now the family I'd chosen and who'd chosen me back. The mother who'd thrown me away at 16 had given me the greatest gift without meaning to the knowledge that I needed no one's approval but my own. The title of my story promised that after 11 years they'd be begging. But sitting there in the life I'd built from ruins, I realized the real victory wasn't in their regret or apologies. It wasn't even in the money or success. The real victory was that their begging didn't matter anymore. I'd spent years imagining my revenge, picturing their faces when they realized what they'd thrown away. But when the moment came, I felt nothing but peace. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And I'd finally reached the place where the woman who birthed me was just another stranger with a sad story and poor choices. "Thank you, Mom," I whispered to the photo of my 16-year-old self I kept on my desk. "Thank you for teaching me I needed no one but myself. Thank you for showing me exactly who I never wanted to be. Thank you for the cruelty that became my strength and the abandonment that became my freedom. Most of all, thank you for being so horrible that I had no choice but to become extraordinary. Your worst decision was my best beginning." And that check I gave Derek. That was my receipt marking the final transaction between us. Paid in full, no balance owed, account closed forever. So to everyone watching who's ever been thrown away, discarded, or told you'd never make it, let me ask you this. What's your story of rising from the ashes? Have you ever had to prove someone wrong who said you'd fail? Drop a comment below sharing your journey, because every survival story deserves to be heard. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of triumph over adversity. Share this video with anyone who needs reminded that rock bottom can become the foundation for something amazing. Remember, the best revenge isn't making them regret what they did. It's building a life so beautiful that what they did becomes irrelevant. Until next time, keep rising, keep building, and never let anyone's cruelty define your worth.